I'm Batman.
The time has finally come. We're putting the tights and spandex firmly back into the closet and getting fully suited up in some vulcanized rubber and a leather cape. Cause today on DC Revisited, we're exploring the film that changed superheroes forever, Tim Burton's Batman. While the Batman character is quite the cinematic tour de force today, it wasn't always that way. Adam West's Batman had left a very silly impression on people in the 60s, and simply wasn't taken serious. Pow, zap, wham would often accompany Batman in this time period, and it's hard to look intimidating with those. When Richard Donner's Superman released in theaters, it was a message to Hollywood that comics were viable film options. Michael Keaton could see the potential in Batman. He wanted to take the character back to its roots and give other comic book fans a true adaptation of Bob Kane and Bill Finger's work. Partnering with Benjamin Melniker, Keaton was able to snag the rights to the character and set out to make the Batman film he'd always wanted to see. They pitched their idea of a dark Batman to several studios, but Hollywood still wanted Adam West's Batman, so it was a non-starter. The movie was publicly announced at the Comic Art Convention in New York in 1980. Not only that, but without a studio involved, it was announced at a budget of $15 million. It was this display of confidence that ultimately won over Warner Brothers, who decided to produce the film, but the tone was still undecided. Superman writer Tom Mankiewicz submitted a script in June 1983 titled The Batman. This was more of an origin story, focusing on both Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson. The Joker and Rupert Thorne would have been the villains, with Silver St. Cloud being the love interest. The Penguin would even appear in a cameo role. The mood of the script was still rather campy, being more in line with Donner's Superman than the darker image that Keaton had of the Caped Crusader. But with Superman's huge success, it was hard to convince the studio to go in any other direction. Things changed once Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's The Killing Joke found massive success. This version of Batman was much more dark and grounded, even nasty at parts. This new direction, as well as the public fervor for it, finally convinced Warner Brothers to go with a meaner version of The Dark Knight. It also helped that the lighter Superman series had been steadily on the decline throughout the 80s. Some unexpected names wanted to be involved in the development, with both Ivan Reitman and Joe Dante showing interest. Reitman was said to have been developing it with Bill Murray to star, obviously leaning into a more comedic tone, but the studio ultimately went with Tim Burton after Pee-wee's Big Adventure found huge success. He seemed to have just the eclectic touch to provide a unique movie and not just a Superman ripoff. Feeling Mankiewicz's script was just too campy, Burton had his then-girlfriend, Julie Hickson, write a 30-page treatment. Very little happened with this treatment, and instead, Steve Englehart was brought on to write a new treatment in 1986. Keeping the same characters as Mankiewicz, he mostly adapted his own comic, Batman's Strange Apparitions. Eventually, Penguin and Dick Grayson were excised from his second treatment out of fear of having too many characters. Wanting to properly represent comic book fandom, Burton approached Sam Hamm to write the screenplay. Hamm, being a massive comic book fan, ended up being absolutely pivotal to the production. He shifted the story from an origin to one where Batman is more mysterious, and we are given glimpses of his origin through flashback. He replaced Silver St. Cloud with Vicky Vale and brought in an entirely new character of Carl Grissom. His script did feature Dick Grayson, but it was nothing more than a cameo role to help set up the Robin character. Even original creator Bob Kane had approved of the script. But still, Warner Brothers had reservations. It wasn't until Burton's Beetlejuice was released to great success that they finally gave the film the green light. But that's when a whole new can of worms was opened.
How's my best girl?
In the 1980s, Michael Keaton was mostly known as a comedic actor. With films like Mr. Mom and Johnny Dangerously, there was a certain expectation when you saw Keaton on screen. So you can imagine the fanboy fury that arose when Keaton was announced in the role of Batman. Absolute chaos. While dramatic A-listers like Mel Gibson, Kevin Costner, and even Tom Selleck were all considered, the studio had actually approached Pierce Brosnan about the role. But he had no interest in playing a comic book character, especially when a certain British spy position was about to be open. Producer John Peters suggested Michael Keaton after seeing his dramatic turn in Clean and Sober. Having worked with Keaton on Beetlejuice, Burton had enormous trust in him and agreed, but fans couldn't see it and sent more than 50,000 protest letters. They were concerned the film would be treading the same territory as the Adam West era and just couldn't see Keaton as the dark and brooding lead. Bob Kane really sums it up best.
He's a realistic Batman. He's not the atypical image. And sometimes when you go against typecasting, you have even a better show.
And ultimately, that's why Keaton's Batman just works. Out of the suit, he's not intimidating and looks like someone who needs to dress up as a bat in order to fight criminals. And it was actually Keaton that came up with the idea of changing his voice while under the cowl, a trademark for the character now.
Where are they?
Almost as important as casting Batman, the decision of who would be the Joker still loomed large. Tim Curry, David Bowie, and even John Lithgow were all considered for the role. Tim Burton wanted John Glover, but the studio wanted a big-name star and declined. But there was always one actor that seemed obvious to both producers and the fans: Jack Nicholson. His charisma was Joker personified. He was so much of an obvious choice that he was the studio's top pick going back to 1980. But there was an issue. Nicholson wasn't interested. After many years of prodding, Peters ultimately relented and went to Robin Williams with an offer for the role. This turned out to just be a ploy to get Nicholson to agree, but it came with some pretty serious caveats. Jack was to only film for 3 weeks, something that changed once production was delayed. He would be entitled to a set number of hours off per day, and he would be off for Los Angeles Lakers home games. Then there was his compensation, which had been reduced from $10 million to $6 million in exchange for a percentage of the film's earnings. Seeing as how this included merchandise, this is said to have paid out in the $90 million range. Yowza. Add in the fact that Nicholson was given top billing and he made out like a bandit. Pretty apropos for the Joker. Playing the role of Bruce Wayne's loyal family butler, Alfred, was Michael Gough. He exudes wisdom while also providing some of the more lighthearted moments. Though, just to be clear, Alfred totally blows Bruce's cover here.
I'll talk to you guys when you get back.
Back, Miss Vale? We're going to be here for quite a while.
Come on, Alfred, he's doing Batman stuff. Get your act together. Speaking of Vicky Vale, Sean Young was originally cast as the fearless photographer. Shortly before filming, though, she had a horse riding accident which forced her to drop out. Thankfully, Kim Basinger was available and stepped into the role, which ended up being one of her most memorable. While she's mostly a damsel in distress, there are glimpses of a strong woman here, with her even figuring out Batman's secret identity. Robert Wuhl is featured as Vicky's co-worker Alexander Knox. While it's a really small part, Wuhl really brings a certain charm to it. His goofy persona always stood out to me as a kid. And I wasn't the only one, as Knox was originally supposed to die during the parade scene, but the producers liked him so much that they brought him back for the ending. In one of the only roles that carried over to the sequels, Pat Hingle starred as Commissioner Jim Gordon. While this is a pretty massive role in the comics, and even in the Nolan films, here he's just relegated to random exposition.
Why wasn't I told about this? Who's in charge?
Eckhart, sir.
Oh my God.
Playing District Attorney Harvey Dent was Billy D. Williams. While the role in this film was rather small, as most fans know, the Harvey Dent character eventually becomes villain Two-Face. Concept art was even made for Williams as the character, and he was given a contract that guaranteed he'd eventually play the role in any subsequent sequel. Take note of that, because we may have something to talk about in a future video. Meet Bob. Bob is the gold standard when it comes to supervillain sidekicks. Played by Tracy Walter, Bob is really the only one of Joker's henchmen that gets a name, and for good reason. He's absurdly loyal. I mean, he even gives Joker the gun that kills him. Rounding out the cast was Jack Palance as mob boss Carl Grissom. His gravitas would be unmatched if it weren't for the fact that he shares scenes with Nicholson. Consider it matched and then some. But they play off each other in such wonderful ways that it feels like a master class in scenery chewing.
Wait till they get a load of me.
At this point, it's safe to assume most people know the story of Batman. But for those that don't, let's summarize. As a child, Bruce Wayne's parents were killed tragically in an alley. He grows up to dress as a bat and fight crime. But Burton takes this story and adds some layers that make it a much more complicated tale. Gotham City is approaching its 200-year anniversary, and the mayor wants to put a stop to the overabundance of crime. Jack Napier is on the other side of the aisle, wanting to take over the criminal underworld. Unfortunately for him, his boss knows of his plans and tries to get rid of him, instead unleashing upon Gotham City one of the greatest villains to ever live, the Joker. Will Batman be able to stop him, especially when it comes to light that he's more connected to Bruce's past than he originally thought? It's a good one. Batman's uniqueness starts right with the opening credits, being one of the first films to alter the studio logo when throwing to the credits. This transition really sets up the whirlwind journey into Burton's Gotham. Production designer Anton Furst helps create this wonderfully dystopian metropolis. Its mixture of architectural styles and loudness really tells the story of Gotham City's corruption. The miniatures are what really help bring scale to the film. Right from the onset, with the massive structures passing by as the credits roll, that we slowly come to realize it's the bat symbol. It's this kind of camera work that brings a massive scale to every part of the film. Burton is a master of the frame here.
Does he get those wonderful toys?
While not portrayed by any actor, the Batmobile is practically a character with the impression it leaves on you. Its stellar design by Julian Caldo and later construction by John Evans made it look like the coolest vehicle you've ever seen, with flames even shooting out of the back and a hatch-style entry. While its awkward shape made it incredibly difficult to drive, that didn't stop its cool factor. Speaking of cool, could Batman look any cooler than in this suit? Upgraded from simple spandex, this all-black rubber and leather mishmash was designed by Bob Ringwood. Burton felt the spandex was too dated and needed something to make Keaton look intimidating. I'd say job well done, though we'll just ignore the Nike product placement here. Filmed at Pinewood Studios in England, the production took up 18 sound stages during its 166-day production. The Gotham City set was the largest ever built at the time. When you see it for yourself, there's no surprise given its awe-inspiring scale. But with these massive sets came massive challenges, and the production quickly spiraled out of control. Burton called filming the worst period of his life. The original production budget ballooned from $30 to $48 million and appeared in more and more trouble with each passing day. The rush production meant some things had to happen that left some comic fans really unhappy. Like Alfred letting Vicky Vale into the Batcave. This was deemed to just be a pacing issue where they needed to get the story along, and this was the solution they came up with. Due to the 1988 writer's strike, Sam Hamm was not on set, and instead, Warren Scarron, Jonathan Gems, and Charles McCown all took part in rewrites. Hamm hated the rewrites, and it's interesting to think about what the film would have been had the strike not happened. The score by Danny Elfman is all sorts of iconic, which makes it surprising that Elfman himself isn't a fan. He claims that the audio engineers didn't mix it properly, and they simply didn't care. Given how fantastic his work is here, especially in the opening, I'd be curious to hear what Elfman's original intention for the tracks were. But when it comes to the music, we have to talk about another element, Prince. While Burton wasn't a fan of including commercial music, the producers insisted on it. Elfman had based some of his score off of Prince's songs. Prince even released a full concept album. So if you're a fan of the tunes in Batman, I definitely recommend you check it out. Promotion for the film had started nearly a year before release, with posters going up in major markets across the United States. Still contending with negative fan perception regarding Keaton's casting, a teaser trailer was thrown together without music in order to drum up anticipation. It worked, and Batman was the talk of the town. Released on June 22, 1989, Batman was an absolute smash success, bringing in $40 million on its opening weekend. Ending its run at over $400 million worldwide, Batman's mark on Hollywood was indelible. Add to that the rather positive reviews, and you've got a massive success. That's not to say it didn't have its detractors, though. Some critics claim the film was just too dark to be a superhero movie. Then there were comic book fans that were quite upset at the idea of the Joker killing Bruce's parents. But even still, the film was ultimately well liked. The novelization even entered the New York Times bestsellers list and remained for several weeks. Batmania was in full effect. When Batman released on VHS, Warner raked in another $150 million in sales. It was the biggest success around, and its iconic box art was a staple of VHS collections everywhere. In fact, its massive home video success is said to have had a huge impact on second-run movie theaters, which have all but since died off. Fan obsession with Tim Burton's Batman has extended to present day, with the release of the comic book series Batman '89. This was a continuation of Burton's world and even had Sam Hamm returning to write. So if you're wanting to see even more of this world, that's the place to look. Billy D. Williams was finally able to step into the shoes of Two-Face in Lego Batman the Movie in 2017. Even now, amongst the barrage of other superhero films, Burton's Batman stands out as dark and unique. After the massive success of the original Batman, Warner Brothers was ready to get a new film in production immediately. They even saved the sets at Pinewood Studios, at great cost to them. But wanting to take a bit of a break, Tim Burton went and made Edward Scissorhands as a sort of palate cleanser. The studio decided to move the production from England over to the Warner lot in California to make it a little more appealing. Even still, Burton didn't want to return and was very reluctant. He'd felt he'd already done his Batman film and didn't have anything else to say with the character. Things changed when the studio approached him about making it simply a Tim Burton film. This would allow Burton to really embrace all of his weird tendencies and create something wholly unique. They also demoted Peter Gruber and John Peters from producers to executive producers. Burton even asked that Peters be banned from set due to the creative spats he'd had with Tim on the original film. And just like that, Burton was on board. But there was still the question of story. Thanks for watching DC Films Revisited. If you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now, like this video, and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video comes up. Now, back to the show. Bringing back original screenwriter Sam Hamm, there were already ideas in place for where the film would go. The studio really wanted the Penguin as the main villain, while Burton and Hamm wanted Catwoman. In order to appease both parties, Catwoman and Penguin were both used for the story. Hamm originally devised a script that brought back Vicky Vale and even introduced Dick Grayson's Robin. The main plot would revolve around Catwoman and the Penguin trying to break into the Batcave in order to find secret treasure. Almost feels like an episode of the 60s Batman TV show. Unimpressed with Hamm's script, Burton brought in writer Daniel Waters, who had recently impressed him with Heathers. It was Waters that brought in the Max Schreck character, wanting to show that the true villains of the world don't necessarily wear scary costumes, and instead dress in business suits and act like they're doing what's right. It would also feature the Penguin running for mayor, which, ironically enough, was actually the plot of an old Batman episode. With two different villains, both of whom getting set up with backstories, there was concern over too many characters. Because of this, Vicky Vale, Robin, and Harvey Dent were all removed from the script. Vale was deemed unnecessary since they were setting up the romance between Batman and Catwoman. While Billy D. Williams wanted to return as Dent, Waters didn't feel Harvey worked as Penguin's handler, so he used Max Schreck instead. Robin was requested by the studio and had been featured quite heavily in early drafts. Marlon Wayans was even cast and paid for the role. Despite this, though, they opted to delete his character before filming and save him for future movies. Eventually, Wesley Strick took over scripting duties and was the on-set writer during filming. Burton and Strick decided to focus on the story of Oswald Cobblepot, aka the Penguin, trying to become mayor, while secretly plotting to kill all of Gotham's firstborn sons.
You gotta admit, I played this stinking city like a harp from hell!
Penguin's campaign is funded by corrupt businessman Max Schreck, who attempted to kill his assistant, Selina Kyle. Instead, she's reborn as Catwoman and out for vengeance. Batman is tasked with stopping them all, while a complicated romance forms with Miss Kyle. It's very comic booky and just works. One of the most fascinating aspects that Burton looked to explore was the parallel between Bruce Wayne and Oswald Cobblepot. Both were sons of the Gotham elite, yet have come out of it on complete opposite sides of tragedy. And the main difference between the two appears to be parental love. Bruce has his strong sense of morals and justice because of his parents' guidance. Oswald, on the other hand, was a freak abandoned by his parents and left to fend for himself. It's not hard to see why one became a hero and the other a villain. It's an intriguing dilemma, but Burton still had to make sure he had the right actors in place to pull it off. Returning to the role of Bruce Wayne in Batman was Michael Keaton. He had won over droves of fans with his performance and was given a significant pay bump to reflect that. But even still, Keaton struggled with returning to the role. Having never taken part in a sequel, he found himself parodying his original performance on the first day of filming. After some reflection, Keaton decided to take on the character like it was his first time. Because of this, his Bruce Wayne feels a little lighter and more playful than previously shown.
Eat floor. High fiber.
Danny DeVito was really the only person considered for the role of the Penguin. Even Water Cooler Talk had him fan cast as the character and was the only actor dictated by the studio. Burton liked the idea and they were off to the races. His depiction is unlike anything seen in the comics. While the Burgess Meredith version of the character presented a more mob boss mentality, DeVito's was a pure psychopath. He kills on a whim and wants brutal vengeance on those who wronged him. This nastiness transferred to his physical appearance, with him almost resembling a penguin with his large nose and flippers. It's a spectacular character design, and it's one of many reasons the Penguin is so memorable.
Why is there always someone who brings eggs and tomatoes to a speech?
Speculation regarding the character had been so rampant, and the production so secretive, that when photos from set were leaked, Warner Brothers hired a private investigator to find out who leaked it. Sounds like something Marvel would do today. The role of Catwoman and her alter ego, Selina Kyle, was originally cast with Annette Bening. Just before production, Bening had to call Burton to inform him that she was pregnant. Given the amount of stunt work, and I mean, look at that costume, she had to be recast. Man, what is it about these Batman love interests? In fact, speaking of Sean Young, she even campaigned for the role, showing up to the producers' offices dressed as the character. She then even appeared on the Joan Rivers show, pleading for the part. Unfortunately, she just wasn't the right person, and they passed. Instead, Michelle Pfeiffer stepped into the skin-tight catsuit and brought about so many iconic moments, all her own. Remember this shot of her whipping the heads off of 4 mannequins? Pfeiffer did this on the first take. She completely owns the role. Her transformation from a meek secretary into the iconic cat burglar is brilliant. Over 60 catsuits were used during the production, and they were constantly tearing. At $1,000 a pop, that didn't come cheap. Her commitment to the role, though, was unwavering. That's a real bird, by the way. Pfeiffer thought the bird puppets looked too fake, so she opted for the real one instead. Total Selina Kyle move. Michael Gough returned to the role of Alfred. He serves the same purpose that he usually does, assisting Bruce. He still provides some of the better moments.
Cold. It's vice versa. It's supposed to be cold.
But the role still feels a bit shortchanged.
Selina Kyle, you're fired.
Christopher Walken was cast as Max Schreck, the businessman who helped fund Penguin's insane run for mayor. Burton originally wanted David Bowie for the role, but he turned it down in order to appear in Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. Burton's main reason for not wanting Walken was pretty simple. He was scared of him. I'd say that scariness certainly lent itself to the role. Paul Rubens appears in the opening as Mr. Cobblepot, Oswald's terrible father. Originally, Burton wanted Burgess Meredith to play the role. Meredith had been the Penguin in the old Adam West Batman series, so it would have been a nice callback. But his declining health prevented him from taking on the role. Pat Hingle returned as Commissioner Jim Gordon, but he continues to have very little to do here. Burton has maligned the pre-production process of this film, given that it was a burgeoning franchise. He had meetings with toy executives about characters they were still in the midst of designing. Suddenly, creative decisions were being made in order to satisfy a totally different form of revenue outside of ticket sales. The batsuit was redesigned, but they kept the general look from the first film intact. They replaced the human anatomy of the armor with a more Art Deco style. They also aimed to make it slightly more functional for Keaton and his stunt double. These slight changes are all over the movie, even with the Batmobile getting a major transformation in the second act. Production designer Anton Furst was unable to return despite having won an Oscar for the first because of contractual obligations. Bo Welch replaced him and further solidified Gotham City's weird dystopic feel. But where Furst went for dingy and drab with a little more of a noir flair, Welch utilized a whole palette of colors in order to give the world texture, and it really works. The Christmas aesthetic mixed with the more circus look of the Red Triangle Gang make the film stand out even 30 years later. The journey across the snowy, abandoned zoo, only to reveal that it's Penguin's lair, is pure genius. Of course that's where his base would be. One of the most memorable visuals of the film is the army of penguins that descend upon Gotham. The production wanted king penguins, but they were only domesticated in one area of England, so they had to be flown over to the United States and housed in cold facilities. But even still, penguins are just animals, and weren't able to do much outside of march. So anytime you see someone interacting with the penguins, it's a puppet. Mixing animatronics with little people in suits, Stan Winston provided some truly amazing visual effects. Hilariously enough, the movie even makes fun of something that had really annoyed fans in the previous film.
Security? Who let Vicky Vale into the Batcave? I'm sitting there working and I turn around, there she is. Oh, hi Vic, come on in.
This kind of self-awareness felt unheard of at the time. The studio was even aware that the Catwoman character would be huge for them. Wonder why. So they spent $500,000 for a last-minute reshoot. See, originally Catwoman's fate was much more ambiguous, but the studio wanted to make it more clear that she survived the whole ordeal. Plus, they felt it would tie in with the ending of the first. After loads of stress on the creative team, the new ending was inserted just before release. Danny Elfman returned to score the music, and it feels even grander than his previous work. As a result of Burton having more creative control, there was no Prince music, and instead a single song by Susie and the Banshees, titled Face to Face, was produced for the film. You can hear parts of the song during the huge masquerade ball, but it's featured significantly less than Prince was.
Bruce Wayne, why are you dressed up like Batman?
Because he is Batman, you moron.
Batman Returns released to theaters on June 19th, 1992, and brought in $45 million during its opening weekend. This was slightly better than the previous film, but the reaction was very polarizing. It was deemed to be too dark, and not what a comic book movie should be in their eyes. Which I suppose is understandable since the opening of the film involves a cat being murdered and parents throwing their baby into a river. Not exactly lighthearted family fun. This resulted in a smaller box office than the first film, bringing in $266 million worldwide. Groups of parents opposed the film due to its dark nature, saying it was still being marketed towards children despite its tone. And there's some truth to this, as there was a McDonald's tie-in promotion that featured the Penguin, whose image is pretty frightening. But the studio just pointed to the film's rating. Putting it on Happy Meals still seemed questionable though. While they did continue the trend of novelizations, Returns wasn't quite as successful as its predecessor, unable to crack the New York Times bestsellers list. In terms of home video releases, Batman Returns was a massive success on both VHS and Laserdisc. Unfortunately, the last time Warner really did anything with the movie was way back in 2005. Even the most recent 4K release is simply a reskin of their prior features. Given the recent landscape of comic book movies, it'd be interesting to see a more modern retrospective look from the cast and creators. I'd regret it if I made it through the Burton Batman films without talking about its tremendous influence on Batman the Animated Series. With a score by Danny Elfman, they really take a lot of inspiration from Burton, while able to dive deeper into the comic book origins. It's often considered the gold standard for Batman media, and it wouldn't have been possible without Burton's Batman films. Michael Keaton will be appearing in the upcoming film The Flash alongside Ezra Miller. He's going to be appearing in the batsuit, so the question now is whether it's the '89 version or the Art Deco one from Returns. Either way, it should be a sight to behold. While Michelle Pfeiffer never returned to the DC universe, she is currently appearing in the MCU as the original Wasp, Janet Van Dyne, in Ant-Man. And I mean, we did get Danny DeVito as Man-Spider, so I guess that's something. While none of the main cast may have appeared in any other DC work, you may recognize one of Penguin's clowns. That's Doug Jones. You may recognize him as the creature from The Shape of Water, Abe Sapien from Hellboy, or even one of the best Buffy villains ever. But he's also appeared as Deathbolt in the CW's Arrowverse. While Tim Burton's Batman Returns was darker than most expected, it's that unique tone that really helps it stand out. Whether you prefer this one or the first, a certain quality exists in Burton's Batman that dissipates with his absence. Batman has never been darker, weirder, and ultimately more fun than what's presented here. With Burton's darker vision resulting in less revenue than expected, a more commercial approach was being discussed by the studio. After the reaction to Batman Returns, which labeled the film as overly dark, a big change was on the horizon. While Tim Burton met with execs to discuss a third film, they seemed less than enthusiastic. He got the impression that they didn't want him to direct the film, repeatedly insisting that he focus on a smaller project instead. So he left. Directionless, the studio had to get to work. Joel Schumacher was chosen after his work on The Client impressed both the studio as well as Burton, who gave his approval on the new director. Burton even remained on the movie as a producer. Schumacher was preparing his film, with Keaton still intended to star, but Keaton was struggling with the idea of returning to the role. While he was interested when Joel was still toying with the idea of adapting Batman Year One, that interest disappeared when the studio mandated a full-on sequel. Not wanting to repeat himself, Keaton left the project. So the task of finding the correct Batman was yet again underway. Ethan Hawke and Billy Baldwin were both considered, as they were on the rise at the time. As was Val Kilmer, who lit the world on fire with his performance as Doc Holliday in Tombstone.
I'm your huckleberry.
Studios took notice. When Kilmer was offered the role, he was actually researching for a different movie in a cave in Africa, surrounded by bats. Taking this as a sign, he accepted the part without reading a script.
Insightful. Naive, but insightful.
His Batman has been the subject of both praise and criticism, and he's been very vocal about his dislike for being in the batsuit, which essentially made him deaf. But it's hard to deny how much they nailed the look. Lee and Janet Scott Batchelor were brought aboard to write the script, and they crafted the story that played with the idea of Bruce's duality. The villains were to be the Riddler and Scarecrow, and finally introduced the Dick Grayson character, who would eventually become Robin. The Riddler was originally much more psychotic, even having a pet rat that he spoke to. This was lightened up, worrying that they wouldn't appeal to younger audiences. Schumacher also felt that the Scarecrow character was too dark. Bringing on his screenwriter from The Client, Akiva Goldsman, they replaced Scarecrow with Two-Face and kept the theme of identity. The villains are on a journey to destroy Batman and take over Gotham through mind control. It's about as comic booky as you can get, which is precisely what Joel was going for. As you may remember, when Billy D. Williams was cast as Harvey Dent in Batman, he was contracted to be Two-Face in any future film. But Schumacher wanted to go in a different direction, so Williams was bought out of his contract. The part was actually offered to Mel Gibson, but he was busy with Braveheart. Having worked with Tommy Lee Jones on The Client, Schumacher offered him the role, but he was hesitant to accept. He ended up relenting after his son insisted he take it. A decision he may live to regret.
If I was a superhero, where would I hide?
Given the Riddler's more comedic side, the studio approached Robin Williams about taking on the part. However, Williams was still angry that the studio had baited him with the Joker role in the first film, so he declined the offer. In a very weird turn of events, Michael Jackson aggressively campaigned for the role. Yes, that Michael Jackson. Thankfully, the studio wasn't interested and wanted someone that could pull off the humorous element. Brad Dourif, Adam Sandler, and even John Malkovich were considered. But there was one person taking the world by storm in the mid-90s, Jim Carrey. There had been rumors for years about Jones and Carrey not getting along on set. This was confirmed by Carrey himself in an interview with the late Norm Macdonald.
He went like to hug me and he said, "I hate you. I really don't like you."
Wow, that's pretty rough to say to someone you're working with. Given how much Riddler outshines Two-Face in the film, it's not a stretch to say that most of this stemmed from jealousy.
Has anybody ever told you you have a serious impulse control problem?
Even Schumacher threw shade at Jones in an interview. "I'm tired of defending overpaid, overprivileged actors. I pray I don't work with them again." So, clearly it wasn't the best experience on set, but Carrey really brought it, providing an overtly charismatic version of the character. He was so uniquely Jim Carrey that several instances where stunt performers would have been used, like the destruction of the Batcave, was actually Jim. Schumacher just didn't feel like any performer could properly reenact the pure tour de force known as Jim Carrey. And he was probably right.
You know, it's always risky introducing a tamed animal into the wild.
The role of Robin was originally set for Marlon Wayans in Batman Returns. Given that he was even paid for the role, his return seemed like a foregone conclusion. But with a different creative team came a different vision for Robin, so the search was on again. Leonardo DiCaprio met with Schumacher for the role, but didn't feel it was right for him and declined. Matt Damon, Mark Wahlberg, and Christian Bale were all considered, but the part eventually went to Chris O'Donnell. He had impressed the studio with Scent of a Woman, and they thought he had the right appeal for the female demographic. For the role of the love interest, Rene Russo was originally cast as Dr. Chase Meridian, but when Keaton dropped out, Warner felt Russo was too old to play Kilmer's love interest. An absurd idea considering she was just 5 years older and still looked like this. Sandra Bullock, Robin Wright, and Linda Hamilton were all considered for the part, until Nicole Kidman was cast. Schumacher had to fight for her though, as the studio didn't think she was sexy enough. This scene convinced them. Her Dr. Meridian character is essentially just really horned up for Batman, and her character arc seems to be, oh hey, I love Batman, or wait, I really love Bruce. Wait, they're the same person? Oh geez. Expanding upon the roles of the women in this franchise, Debbie Mazar and Drew Barrymore were cast as the sidekicks of Two-Face, Sugar and Spice. They're playful and mostly exist for the villains to vamp with. They were originally called Leather and Lace, but being as it's a kids movie, Warner asked for a change. Pat Hingle returns as Commissioner Jim Gordon, and Michael Gough returns as loyal butler Alfred Pennyworth. They each have a little more to do in this, but their role is still mostly exposition. The addition of Dick Grayson gives them slightly more purpose, since they essentially have a rebellious teenager to take care of. Alfred even roasts Bruce at one point.
You really are quite bright, despite what people say.
Savage. This film marks the start of several cameos by US Senator Patrick Leahy in the Batman franchise. He was a massive Batman fan and even wrote the foreword to The Dark Knight Archives. Bob Kane was on set at least once a week with a chair set up right next to Schumacher's. This allowed him to be more hands-on than he ever was on the Burton films, though his specific contributions were quite minor. His wife, Elizabeth Sanders, even gets a part as Gossip Gertie. Oh yeah, and does this guy look familiar? That's right, long before he was directing Iron Man, Jon Favreau actually showed up in a Batman movie. Crazy. Remember all the brilliant work done on Gotham City by both Anton Furst and Bo Welch? Well, wipe that all from your mind and let me introduce you to this CGI monstrosity. Schumacher wanted to avoid the designs of the prior films, so he brought Barbara Ling on as the production designer. He wanted neon to represent the comics of the 40s and 50s, and he wanted huge faces to give the city personality. Talk about being very literal. But it's not all CGI monstrosities. There are some really impressive sets here. The Batcave is huge in scale and just beautifully lit. Two-Face's base features these really contrasting styles to show his different personalities. Then the Riddler base at the end feels like big-budget Adam West Batman. Famous makeup designer Rick Baker was brought on to do the Two-Face makeup effects. The bright pink helps make the design a little less grotesque. I mean, just imagine if this were the color of blood and flesh. Yikes. Bob Ringwood redesigned the batsuit back to the armor that resembled human anatomy. Schumacher felt Batman should look like a Greek god. I guess that explains the nipples. Robin's suit had a very similar Greek god look, though we were given more of the classic design earlier on in the film. Strangely enough, the main look of the Batmobile was based on the works of H.R. Giger from the Alien franchise. Schumacher wanted it to look more organic than the Burton versions. While the Giger design was rejected, a less intense version was made by Alan Pike. The other designs are rather silly and seem to be more of a callback to the Adam West Batmobile. Despite Danny Elfman's score being iconic, Schumacher wanted to do away with it entirely. He hired Elliot Goldenthal to score the film, with the caveat that it be an entirely original composition. Goldenthal actually does a great job and provides some memorable themes. But it gets a little sketchy when you realize they used Elfman's score to advertise the film. Then there's the pop group En Vogue, who shows up as, street workers? Then, harkening back to the days of Prince and Batman, both U2 and Seal were used for the soundtrack, providing the hit singles Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me, and Kiss from a Rose. I shouldn't even need to tell you how much both of these songs rule. They established fairly early on that this is a much lighter movie than prior entries.
Can I persuade you to take a sandwich with you, sir?
I'll get drive-through.
But for a kids movie, they sure do a lot of adult stuff. Dr. Meridian literally tries to use the bat symbol as a booty call. Riddler gets deformed in a really disturbing way. Then there are all the flashbacks to Bruce's childhood as he's walking between his parents' caskets. For a movie that wanted to be lighter, it was really sending mixed messages.
You see, I'm both Bruce Wayne and Batman. Not because I have to be, because I choose to be.
Batman Forever released to theaters on June 16, 1995, and brought in $52 million on its opening weekend. This was the highest opening weekend at the time, and ended its run at $336 million. The film was ridiculously successful outside of just box office gross. Toys, video games, and even the soundtrack was a big hit. There were actually 2 separate novelizations based on the film, one by Peter David and the other by Alan Grant. No, not that Alan Grant. David wrote the true version while Grant wrote the kids' adaptation. The movie had not been well received by critics, although it has gained in esteem more recently. Despite this mixed status, the film actually received multiple Academy Award nominations, including Best Cinematography and Best Sound Effects Editing. The original runtime was 2 hours and 40 minutes, and featured a much darker tone than what was released to theaters. The film opened on Two-Face's escape from Arkham Asylum, and even featured a giant bat during a dream sequence. Some of these deleted scenes exist on the DVD, and they help us glimpse into a slightly different film. In recent years, with so many fan movements demanding original creator cuts of films, there has been a push for the original Schumacher cut to be released. This gained momentum after Schumacher's death in 2020, when Warner confirmed the existence of an alternate cut. This version featured a more serious tone, less Dick Grayson, and more of a focus on the psychological issues of Bruce Wayne. Whether or not this ever sees the light of day is anyone's guess, but after the Snyder Cut, anything is possible. Tommy Lee Jones's dislike for the work kept him firmly out of comic book movies, until Marvel was able to coax him over for Captain America: The First Avenger. Jim Carrey may have never returned to the DC universe, but he is currently the villain, Dr. Robotnik, in the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. Rene Russo also joined the MCU as Frigga in the Thor franchise. Unfortunately, Kilmer's life took quite the turn as he developed throat cancer and lost the use of his voice. His story was brilliantly told in the Amazon documentary Val, so if you're interested in finding out more about his life, I can't recommend it enough. Nicole Kidman recently returned to the DC Cinematic Universe in Aquaman as Atlanta, which makes her the most significant return to DC film. With Batman Forever being the #1 movie of 1995, the producers seemed to have a working formula in place, and it wasn't like they were going to have to cast a new Batman anytime soon, right? Right? While it may have a bit of a mixed reputation now, Batman Forever was a huge success in 1995, so Warner Brothers felt it obvious to bring back the winning team of Joel Schumacher and his screenwriter Akiva Goldsman. But there was one important person who had been involved with Batman up to this point who had declined taking part: Tim Burton. Burton was involved quite significantly in the pre-production process of Forever, but by that point he was well established in Hollywood. and wanted his creative efforts to go towards his own works. With Burton leaving, Peter McGregor Scott was left with more power on the project. Scott, being the one behind most of the commercialization of the prior film, wanted to push even further in that direction. The main mantra when it came to Batman and Robin was that bigger is always better. So the sets were more massive, and the villains were more abundant. Nothing was to be reused from the last movie. And if you've got more villains, then you definitely need more heroes to help fight them. More! But this may be a big reason for what was to come.
Thanks for watching DC Films Revisited. If you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now, like this video, and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video comes up. Now, back to the show.
Schumacher and Goldsman settled early on having Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy as the main antagonists of the film. They added Bane in more of an enforcer role, but outside of his design, he's a far cry from his comic counterpart. The main story would revolve around Mr. Freeze trying to save his wife by taking the city hostage. Poison Ivy, meanwhile, wants to take over the world with her plants. These character motivations were often used before and since, so at least they had that right. But the execution left a lot to be desired. Joel wanted to move things in a campier direction since he felt it would be more akin to comic books. One issue arose just prior to filming. Batman himself, Val Kilmer, didn't want to do the project. Having disliked his time in the batsuit, as well as how much it limited his performing abilities, he wanted out in order to focus on his passion project, The Saint. Schumacher, who didn't particularly enjoy his time working with Val, was fine with recasting, but also annoyed at the late switch. But with the production moving so fast, they needed another commanding lead to wear the batsuit. Joel wanted Billy Baldwin, who was up for the role in Forever. But with the role of Batman being such a massive career maker, Warner took it upon themselves to pick their star. Having massive success on TV's ER, George Clooney was selected to play the Dark Knight.
Hi, Freeze. I'm Batman.
Clooney is a lot of things, but a good Batman is not one of them. He's very stiff with little character work outside of cheesy lines and gimmicks. And his Bruce Wayne feels more like George Clooney playing himself than anything else. Chris O'Donnell returned as Dick Grayson, aka Robin, and we're actually treated to a pretty awesome Robin suit. It's a mixture of what was done in Forever, but adding the aesthetic of Nightwing. The main difference was that Robin's accents were red instead of Nightwing's blue. To this day, it's exciting to see because outside of the Titans TV show, we've never seen this iteration on the big screen again. Otherwise, Robin is the exact same character he was in the last one. An impulsive teenager who looks 30 and can't seem to keep it in his pants. Speaking of which, the object of Robin's affections this time around are Alfred's niece Barbara. After starring in the hit Clueless, Alicia Silverstone was cast in the role. She's referred to as Alfred's niece, which then just brings up a whole slew of questions. Like, why aren't you British? However, most of these can be answered in a deleted scene where Alfred explains that she's actually the daughter of his long-lost love Margaret. Thankfully, unlike her contemporaries, they did not put nipples on her suit, because that would have been inappropriate.
My name is Freeze. Learn it well. It was the chilling sound of your doom.
There have been rumors for years that Patrick Stewart was originally offered the role of Mr. Freeze. This would have more resembled the version of the character that's shown in Batman the Animated Series. But Schumacher has denied this being the case, as he always had a very specific idea of Mr. Freeze being very large, as if chiseled out of glass. Thankfully, one massive movie star fit the bill, and had always wanted to work with Joel: Arnold Schwarzenegger. What would follow is one of the most over-the-top performances you could ever imagine in a comic book movie.
I will pull Batman's heart from his body and feel it freeze in my hands. Revenge!
And don't get me wrong, Arnold is absolutely the star of the show here. Every scene he's in, there's some kind of entertainment value to be had. Take for example when he's making his goons watch Jack Frost and is forcing them to sing.
Louder, come on, sing, come on.
We're a long ways away from Joker killing his goons.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
Well, sort of. But the real genius of his performance comes when you find out he was paid $25 million for only 25 minutes of screen time. And not only that, if Freeze isn't saying a line, it's not Arnold. His stunt double looked so much like him, and the costumes were such a pain to put on, that they often resorted to just using him instead of Schwarzenegger.
I'm poison.
For the role of Poison Ivy, Julia Roberts, Sharon Stone, and even Demi Moore were considered. Eventually, the part went to Uma Thurman. Her performance is both over the top and sexy when she wants it to be. She's actually the one person of the cast that doesn't seem to regret the film, saying it was a great experience. Given how campy her performance is, I'm sure she had an absolute blast. Bane is featured in one of the most popular Batman storylines of all time, in the comic series Nightfall, where he breaks the Caped Crusader's back. So it's disappointing to say that the Bane depicted here is nothing more than a grunting brute. Which shouldn't be a surprise since he's played by former wrestler Jeep Swenson. And sure, the man is technically huge. When you see him getting the makeup put on, it's kind of baffling how he's so large. But when he's shown in the film, his size doesn't really translate. Instead, he just looks really bloated. Even Tom Hardy's Bane, which would come 15 years after, had more of an intimidation factor to him. And he's just a little guy.
We'll have a flawless super soldier out to you tomorrow by overnight mail.
In what could almost be considered another villain role, John Glover was cast as Dr. John Woodrue. He's ultimately the man that creates both Poison Ivy as well as Bane here, but his screen time is brief. As is Vivica A. Fox, who shows up as Mr. Freeze's, mistress? Her role as Miss B. Haven is very confusing given Freeze's loyalty to his wife. Michael Goff, of course, returns as the loyal butler Alfred Pennyworth, and this time he actually has something significant to do. He's the main motivation for the Caped Crusader to stop Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy because he's sick and Freeze has the cure. Because, you know, saving Gotham City wasn't quite enough of a reason. Sure, most of the work requires him to just lay in bed all sickly, but hey, he's doing more than making soup. Pat Hingle returns as Commissioner Gordon, and it's much of the same old, same old. In fact, Gordon is probably the most inept he's ever been, with him giving Ivy the key to the bat signal. The police in this movie are just total buffoons. What exactly was their plan here? And the way they just flop around as they fall down the stairs and Gordon just looks on dumbfounded, it's pretty hard to call them Gotham's finest at this point. In the past, the love interests of Batman have had quite a lot to do. They're photojournalists who cover wars, secretaries who stand up to their corporate bosses, or horny therapists. Okay, maybe that last one isn't quite as impressive, but the one thing they have in common is that they all managed to find out Batman's secret identity. Then we have Julie Madison, played by Elle Macpherson. She contributes, well, not much of anything to the proceedings here. Even Bruce seems fed up with her. The little boy that plays Bruce in flashbacks throughout the film is actually Eric Lloyd, who you may recognize as Charlie from The Santa Claus. And you may also recognize a certain set of costumes hanging in the wing at Arkham. It's this kind of continuity that almost feels old hat now, but back then, these kinds of references were few and far between. Elliot Goldenthal returned to score the film, and he brings much of the same energy he brought in Forever. But they really took the soundtrack up to a whole nother level, filling it with popular artists. They released no less than 4 different music videos by artists such as The Smashing Pumpkins, Bone Thugs and Harmony, Jewel, and even R. Kelly. Yeah, we'll just ignore that last one. The soundtrack was a massive hit, with the Smashing Pumpkins even winning a Grammy for their song, "The End is the Beginning is the End." Barbara Ling returned as the production designer. And if you thought the first one looked comic booky, oh boy. The sets, in keeping with the bigger mantra, are absolutely massive. And while they are extremely impressive feats of engineering, it's hard not to look at them and just see massive toy sets. Everything felt manufactured to be sold as a toy in some way. Which isn't a massive surprise because even Chris O'Donnell found it absurd.
The first one, I felt like I was making a movie. The second one, I felt like I was making a toy commercial.
The Batmobile goes from this cool H.R. Geiger-like design to what can only really be called a plastic toy. But as much as this is referred to as a kids movie, there are some very not so kid-friendly jokes here.
Well, I'm totally over, all right? Positively.
Me too, definitely. Great stems, though.
Buds, too.
Yeah, those are nice.
Maybe this was an attempt at giving the parents something, but it feels very out of place in what is essentially a Saturday morning cartoon.
What are you, about a 50 big and tall?
No, I always go a size smaller. Makes me look slimmer.
The costumes in this follow the toy aesthetic, with everyone getting multiple different outfits throughout the runtime. Even Batgirl, who barely even appears in her first costume, gets upgraded to this blue and silver one. And you're probably wondering, why oh why? I can tell you why. Toys. The more costumes, the more toys could be produced. And it's that shift towards commercialism that took a little something away from the designs. While Clooney's suit looks similar to Kilmer's in the last film, the big thing that's missing is the yellow bat symbol. Without it, it feels just kinda bleh. Which is surprising since the hero costumes were still being designed by Bob Ringwood. I'm going to blame the bigger mantra. In fact, the only design that feels simple is that of Poison Ivy. She has several different looks throughout the movie, and they're equally memorable. Though her main gear definitely takes the cake. We'll just ignore that really bad wig. The most impressive costume comes from Terry English, who spent $1.5 million developing and creating the Mr. Freeze suit. It's an absolute work of art and shows that there are still very talented people working on this film despite the rampant commercialism. Batman and Robin released in the United States on June 20th, 1997, and brought in nearly $43 million at the box office. The film managed to wrap up its worldwide run at $238 million, which was unfortunately the lowest grossing Batman film to date. Critics lambasted the movie for its campy tone and nonsensical plot. Harry Knowles of Ain't It Cool News famously derided the movie, comparing it to old food that you leave in your fridge for weeks. While Schumacher was dismissive of these reviews, calling them nothing more than yellow journalism, it clearly had an impact. The sinking box office and terrible reviews signaled to the upper brass at Warner Brothers that the property was losing steam. The failure of the film reverberated throughout Warner Brothers, who had already been developing a new film about the Man of Steel. Superman Lives was to be directed by Tim Burton and star Nicolas Cage. They were hoping to do the same thing to the character of Superman that Burton had accomplished with Batman, but the box office failure of this film, as well as a slew of creative problems, canceled the project just months before filming was to commence. The animated film Batman and Mr. Freeze Sub-Zero was originally supposed to coincide with the release of Batman and Robin, but it was delayed in order to create separation between the two properties. While multiverses and different versions of the character are quite prominent nowadays, execs at the time were worried about confusing audiences. Thankfully, when Sub-Zero did finally release, it was received much better than the live-action film, and helped continue Batman's success in animated form. Shortly after Batman and Robin's release, Schumacher started developing his third sequel, referred to as both Batman Unchained and Batman Triumphant, which would have seen Scarecrow as the main villain. However, the ill reception to Batman and Robin really turned Schumacher off from continuing the series, feeling as though fans deserved a more comic-accurate depiction. Warner Brothers decided it was time to give the series a rest and focus on other parts of the character. The popular cartoon Batman Beyond featured a young crime fighter in the future, and seemed like the perfect next step. But the project just could never get enough momentum. There are few films that have been derided as much from its own cast and crew than Batman and Robin. Clooney has apologized to fans several times, feeling the film was a total failure.
You know, I thought at the time this was going to be a very good career move. It wasn't.
So it's no surprise that no one from the movie has appeared in other DC works outside of John Glover and his role as Lionel Luthor on Smallville. While it seems like just about everyone and their mother is apologizing for this film, the thing to often remember is that it was very much aimed at kids. I was 6 years old when the film released, and all these dumb decisions they made to get the kids to love the film and buy toys, it worked. Hook, line, and sinker. I absolutely adored this stupid movie. I ran around playing with these toys that didn't even look like they were from the movie, and I desperately wanted a Bat or Robin suit of my own. I remember watching it on Christmas morning as my parents went back to bed, and I was left thinking, why don't they want to watch this awesome movie? Now, older and maybe slightly less stupid, I know exactly what they were thinking.
Freezing hell, Batman!
Most of the early Batman series have found their fans, but the third sequel has always been one that has struggled to find its audience. It is overly long, doesn't make a lot of sense, and is easily the worst acted of the bunch. But that's also where a lot of the entertainment stems from. By no means would I call this a good movie, but based on the silliness we've been showcasing here, it's at least going to give you a few chuckles.
Always winterize your pipes.
The Batman franchise remained in the dark for nearly a decade. Thankfully, an origin story was the savior of the Caped Crusader. But that's a story for next time. Join us, same movie time, same movie channel,